The following program was produced or sponsored by a community member. The views and opinions expressed are the sole responsibility of the producer and do not reflect the views of Malton Access Television, the City of Malton, or your cable provider. MATV welcomes your comments. You can phone us at 781-321-6400 or email us at access@matv.org.
Okay, you ready? Good morning, everybody. In the absence of anybody from the committee, I'll take it by myself. Peter Wester, most of you have seen me before. I'm a regular visitor to Boskone and to Nestor. To introduce my pal, Tom Shippey. I've known Tom for over 40 years, so I think it's a little bit over familiar. I can call him my pal. Tom, of course, is a professor of English and a science fiction fan. Over to you, Tom.
Okie doke, right. Well, first I was going to say thanks very much to the committee of NESFA for inviting me here, but they aren't here, so I just sort of wave at them. So I'll say thanks instead to the members of NESFA for inviting me here. I've been to many conventions, and I've been keynote speaker at far too many academic conferences, but this is the only time I've been a guest at a proper science fiction convention, and I feel it as the high point of a life in science fiction. Well, I say a life in science fiction, and I can raise Peter's 40 years and say, well, it's 50 plus. I can remember, as many of us can, I'm sure, the first moment when the light dawned and I actually became a science fiction reader. And it was in 1958, January 1958, and I must have had flu or something like that, and I was confined to bed for a bit, and I'd read everything in the house 14 times over, and my mother, tired of the constant whining, went down the road to the scruffy little newsagents which we had there, and the only thing she could find was a copy of Astounding Science Fiction, January 1958. That was the British edition, I may say, which is about 4 months behind the American one. So in American terms, it was September 1957. Anyway, she bought that, I started reading it, and everything at that point completely changed. I can still remember it, and of course I still got the issue, but I didn't bring it because it's too damn precious to go risking, among strange people. Someone might take it away from me. But it had the start of Heinlein's Citizen of the Galaxy, a 4-part serial. Read my way through that. And at this point, I may say they cost 1 3/8, was it?
Probably 1 6.
1 6. It went up to 1 9 at one point, and all this. These, of course, are currencies so obsolete, like groats and marks and rose nobles. Nobody knows how they work anymore. But anyway, yeah, there was a 4-part serial, Citizen of the Galaxy. The next one was Poul Anderson's Van Ryn story, The Man Who Counts. We went on to Hal Clement's Close to Critical, and at the end of the year, the December 1958 cover of the British edition was, Peter?
1958 British edition? Oh, 1958. No. Miracle Workers?
It was indeed Jack Vance's The Miracle Workers. Well, what I got to say is...
Sorry, I sort of guessed what you wanted me to say.
All right, there we are. Well, what I got to say is what a year that was. It's not surprising I kept reading it from then on. So I think that really, I must say, I just add that before that period, I was a pretty undistinguished member of a distinguished school, and just knocking along and keeping my place on the team more or less. But at that point, something sort of switched on. My handwriting changed completely, and I started writing things voluntarily and using long words and whatnot. And this was a real, something went click inside my head. I don't know what it was, but I'm sure that it was, in fact, the experience of writing science fiction. So I look back from there to that over 50, very rewarding years, reading science fiction all the time. I also look back over 40 years of being an English professor, which has not been so rewarding by any means. And I'd like to offer two statements in my defense. One is this. I was always a professor of English language, never a professor of English literature. When I took over Tolkien's chair, it was the chair of English language and medieval literature. And as Tolkien would tell you if you were here, in British institutions, the job of the professor of English language was to fight the professors of English literature, which we did all the time. And we always lost because there were more of the bastards than there were of us. But this, I think, has actually backfired, and I will say some more remarks about that later. And the other thing, in my defense, is that this 40 years, etc., was a bit of an accident too, and science fiction probably had something to do with it. During my last year at Cambridge University, for some reason or other, my moral tutor came to visit me in my rooms. In these days, we had moral tutors, no kidding, and we had to wear gowns after dark. And the college was closed at 11 o'clock, and you had to climb in over the bayonet spikes and all that kind of thing, with people, really, breaking their ankles as they fell off, and poor old Paddy got a spike right through his eye. Gosh, and we were standing behind him saying things like, can you lift your head off, Paddy? Easy now, and things like that. So yeah, the Dark Ages lasted a long time, is all I could say. Anyway, in my last year, my moral tutor came in, no doubt I forget what, and I had foolishly failed to clear away the astounding science fictions, which were littered around. And he looked at these, and he said something along the lines of, do you read this stuff? And I couldn't think of an excuse like, oh no, the cleaner must have left them. And 10 days later, and this may have been a coincidence, but I doubt it, he called me in and said he would not recommend me for graduate study because he did not think I could cut it. And I responded to this with the usual stoic indifference on my face and sullen defiance behind it. Yes, he said, that's it, you're not doing graduate work, go away. And I went off and became a salesman for Colgate-Palmolive. So that was the way my career was going, just after I graduated from university, basically we had what I would have said was something like an 18-year recession, 1964 to 1982, during which all the things that we were hired to take over, all the products we were going to market and all that kind of thing, they just folded. So Colgate-Palmolive had no use for scum like me, and I was hurled back into the cruel world, where I became a jam tipper, another terrible trade. Like King Lear, the man that gathers samphire, dreadful trade, says the poet. I had to get these big tubs of fruit and stuff and chip them down into a giant boiling pot. And the main thing was to make certain, first, that you held onto the tub, and second, that you didn't throw yourself in by mistake, because that would be a bad way to go. Boiled to death in boiling lemon curd. Oh, forget it. So all this went on, and then by strange chance, and Peter has in fact put this in the booklet, I got a job as a temporary assistant adjunct professor kind of thing at Birmingham University, which must have been extremely short of people, is all I can say. So I turned up, and the interview, I think the critical moment of the interview was this. They said, what have you been doing? I said, working for Colgate-Palmolive. And they said, what have you been doing there? And I said, well, I've been selling this stuff called Ajax. Ajax, I don't know if it still exists, is a kind of bath scouring powder. And the old Shapiro, I.A. Shapiro, one of the great pedants of the world, said, and what is the purpose of Ajax? And I replied, this is a good one, I replied, why, sir, do you not see? It is for the scouring of a jakes. And this is such a, as Peter says, such a boring, smart-ass pun that Shapiro sort of instantly wrote me down as, somebody who knows the word jakes, I suppose. So he voted for me immediately. Well, on these chances, careers turn, is all I could say. But I also remember the old kindly professor, Terence Spencer, he put his arm around my shoulder after I'd been there a few weeks, and he said in his kindly way, if you don't publish within the next 3 years, you're out. Boy, he knew how to motivate people. So I started writing with such speed and ferocity that I was an Oxford Fellow at 29 and a full professor at 35, without pausing for breath. But all this was about Old English. After my experience with my Moral Tutor, I kept the science fiction stuff and the fantasy stuff very quiet until I was a full professor and had my own department and could do anything I liked after that. Well, since then, I have written a string of articles about science fiction, and Peter, who encouraged me to put them all together, made me write personal introductions to them, which I did with great enthusiasm, realizing how often my introduction consisted of, a long bellyache about my colleagues, or really a kind of process of long, slow outing as I came out and actually became more and more, unguarded in the things I said. Well, okay, so those are the two things. I say this is about the visions and the critics, and I'll drop the stuff about the professors, but I'm coming back to it and turn over to science fiction. And I asked myself, what did I get out of it? What did we get out of it? What did we get out of it that we couldn't get anywhere else? And I'm going to consider that under three headings, really, past, present, and future. First, what triggered the appearance of science fiction? And in thinking about this, I'm considering essentially my father's lifetime. Second, my lifetime. What visions has science fiction produced in my lifetime? And third, future. And why do I feel now as if I'm waiting for something? As if I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, or waiting for the booster rocket to fire? Because I do feel a sort of certain lack at the moment. And this may just be a product of old age and a feeling everything was better way back then, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll take those three items in succession. And I start off with what triggered the appearance of science fiction, which incidentally, and ignoring old Brian Aldiss and Frankenstein and all that stuff, I date real science fiction, the stuff that you can actually read with more than historical interest, back to the 1890s. When I did my Oxford book of science fiction stories, I started with H.G. Wells' Land Ironclads of 1903, and it was somewhere, I think, around there. Okay, so I'm going to ask what triggered the appearance of science fiction, and I will now ask you a question I've never asked anybody before. Do you remember the moment when you realized you were going to die? When you became aware of your own mortality? I feel we should all remember this, because it's obviously a vital moment, and some say it's the thing that distinguishes us from the animals. I'm not sure about that, but it's still certainly a vital moment. Well, you realize that actually all this stuff about death applied to you, and there was a time when you were not going to be there. Well, I remember when this happened to me, and I can remember where I was, which gives me a dating on it. I was actually sitting on the veranda of the family flat in the 4th floor of Alexandra Court, which is off Chowringhee Road in Calcutta. So I was in Calcutta. Now, that means that I was 7 or under, because it was the custom under the great days of the Sarkari Hind, which people nowadays call the Raj, strangely enough, to send British kids back to England or to Scotland at the age of 7. And they did this to make certain that we could speak English, because at that time many of us could not, or could not be bothered to, shall we say. So I must have been 7 or under. I remember incidentally in Beowulf reminiscing about his life like me. He says, "Ich was 7 winter, thou mek seja Baldur at minum fada yanam." I was 7 winters when the Lord of Warriors took me from my father. Yeah, that's right. Some things don't change. Okay. So I must have been under 7. And And I must say, we got sent off to boarding school. And I just like to say another thing, which it was a proper boarding school, not a sissy one like Hogwarts. Hey. We were there, no holidays there. It was 365 days a year. And actually trying to discipline us by forfeiting or gaining house points, well, we would have laughed that to scorn. Anyway, so there I was, 6 or 7, and I don't know what I said to my father, but it was clear that I said something about dying. But I remember what he said to me. He said, "I wouldn't worry about that. By the time you're grown up, they'll probably have found a cure for that. Now, it may be that he was just consoling a little boy, but I think actually he probably meant it. And if I think what happened to him in his life, I think he perhaps had kind of a reason for saying that. If you think of what happened in his lifespan, which was 1904 to 1962, and considering the nature of the changes in that long 50 years, well, think of him. When he was born, the Wright brothers had staggered off the ground, but I'm sure nobody in Middlesbrough knew about it. So as far as they knew, flight did not exist. By the time he died, well, of course, he was very proud of the fact that he had actually flown the Atlantic. And of course, when he was growing up, when he was a young man, a teenager, well, that was the first flight across the Atlantic, Alcock and Brown flying their Vickers-Vimy. And it was a great feat. But not very long after that, it had become, well, still not terribly common, but relatively routine. And of course, by the time he died, the planes which you saw on the airstrips then, the Comets, the jet engine Comets, and the turboprop Viscounts, they would not look out of place really on a modern airstrip. So, that was one thing. Another one, medicine. He was one of 8 children. 5 boys and 3 girls. Yes. All the girls died of TB. The boys slept in one bed, the girls slept in one bed, all the girls caught TB, and they all died, and so did one of the boys. So TB was still a killer. When he went out east in 1927, malaria, of course, was still a killer. And the general thing was, well, you had to keep drinking the whiskey, and don't forget to put the quinine in it. And that was really what they'd got. But by the time he, but not very many years later, both these had been effectively, well, TB had been eradicated in Britain. It's come back since, of course, and malaria at least was now under control as a result of the innovations brought in during World War II. Radio and TV, we hadn't got those in Calcutta. I remember the first time I saw a TV. And actually the big event was seeing Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953. That was, I think, the first one that actually sort of got a mass audience in Britain. And then there were other things which I could mention, one of which, of course, and my father and my grandfather and my father-in-law were all involved in the war against the Japanese in Burma. And that ended, of course, quite unexpectedly with the A-bomb. But nobody in Burma knew that was coming. Hear Brian Aldiss talk about it. A complete shock. To our side as well, because nobody knew that that was happening. So all those things happened, and there was a kind of expectation that this would continue to happen in that sort of way. And it seems to me that in terms of life experience, those 50-plus years saw in more big changes and more sort of accelerated changes than what's happened since. If I compare, as it were, his lifespan, should we say 1900 to 55, and mine, should we say 1955 to 2010, well, what I've seen, of course, has been steady improvement. Don't deny that. I can remember, my first car, which still had a starting handle, which you wound round and round. And nowadays I've got one which actually starts when I turn the damn thing on. And I appreciate this. And, my first book, I did it on a manual typewriter, batter, and then I got an electronic typewriter, now I got a computer. Yeah, steady improvement, but in a way, improvement, not total change. And some things, of course, well, have not been such a success. I'll perhaps say something more about that later. But what I'm just contrasting these two periods, and it seems to me that in my father's lifespan, this is when science fiction emerged. And science fiction was set up and it was driven on by a unique experience of change. That experience of change was more than our experience of change. It wasn't just change, it was this feeling, going back to what I said about the moment when you realize you're going to die, and what my father said, it wasn't just change, it was potential change. My father had a belief, really, in a way, in unlimited potential. And that perhaps has eroded in the time since then, since 1950. Well, what about science fiction in the second period I'm talking about, 1955 to 2010, which is, my own experience? Well, I can't sum it all up. There's too much of it. But in the introduction to, where's it gone? Nesfa's recent publication, which everyone must go out and buy a copy of, if not 2. Okay, this James Blish, Volume 2, Flights of Eagles. In that, my introduction to that, I say, and I mean all these adjectives approvingly, that science fiction has been collective, conventional, and assertive. I'll miss out the last two. Let's just consider science fiction being collective. I don't mean, of course, that they sat around like in a commune and discussed things with each other, because most of the authors are insanely competitive. But it was collective in a way, because the other authors set each other off. They argued with each other. If somebody came out with an idea, somebody would come along 6 weeks later and say, I've got a better idea. Or no, it wouldn't work like that. Or I've got a twist on it. Or I can do this differently. And you could actually trace this quite easily. They struck sparks off each other. But while they were doing that, they produced what I would call a number of collective visions. And I would like to pick out just 4 of them. The first of these collective visions that I noticed was the disaster story, which is very British. John Wyndham wrote them, John Christopher wrote them, J.G. Ballard wrote them, Charles Eric Maine wrote them, D.F. Jones wrote them, and there have been some later, like, Lucifer's Hammer, the Niven and Purnell, and they're coming back. I noticed in 2009 we got Atwood's Year of the Flood, which I haven't read yet, Baxter's Ark, which starts off as a very conventional disaster story, which actually is a bit like J.G. Ballard in that you can't imagine it happening for a moment. But there. And there are others, I think, coming through, like the ones that Kim Stanley Robinson writes. But the early ones that I'm talking about were triggered by 2 things, it seemed to me. One was, of course, war. This was the main experience of the first half of the 20th century. In Day of the Triffids, there are 2 things which intersect to cause the disaster: the Triffids and everybody going blind. And they're both quite clearly caused by the Cold War. The blindness is caused by something which has been released by satellites, and the Triffids are actually a result of biological experimentation in the Soviet Union. So war was one trigger for this, and the other actually was Darwinism. If you read them now, what I realize actually is how funny they are. They're funny disaster stories. Brian Aldiss calls them cozy catastrophes. They're not cozy, they're funny. And the joke actually is on people who can't adapt. And of course, I assume, like myself, thinks, oh, well, I'm not one of those stupid gits. I'll adapt, I'll be out there, I'll be surviving, Peter Weston there, I'll eat him like a flash. No problem. But Wyndham, John Wyndham actually, went to the same school as me, and the same school as J.R.R. Tolkien, King Edward's Birmingham, a distinguished production line for science fiction writers, and there were some others too. And he summed it up in true old Edwardian style in foreign languages. The moral, I think, of Day of the Triffids was, and it's delivered by somebody giving the standard science fiction lecture, which you get in the middle of the story. But the moral of the lecture in the Day of the Triffids is, autre temps, autre mœurs. Other times, other customs. You've got to change your customs or you won't survive. Meanwhile, the Midwich Cuckoos, if you remember that one, he did it in Latin. Si fueris Romae, Romani vivito more, which we might translate as, if you live in Rome, do as the Romans do. But that misses something important out, which is Wyndham's use of the future subjunctive tense. Well, I'm glad I appreciated that, because I suspect a lot of people didn't. But there, that was a true old Edwardian remark, I must say. But what he said was, it says, live in Rome, do as the Romans do, but actually it's rephrased at the end, if you live in the jungle, you must live by the law of the jungle. And the answer to that is, hey, we're talking about Midwich in the middle of England. England is the least jungle-like place in the world. It's a garden. It hasn't been invaded for 900 years, unlike most European countries. Civil wars were over 300 years ago. There are no dangerous animals except my cat and a few other things like that. Midwich, of course, as he points out, is a place where nothing has happened for hundreds of years. And then suddenly something does happen. Just because something hasn't happened, nothing has happened for hundreds of years, doesn't mean it ain't going to. So actually, it's trying to get you to a new realization of what things are like, what things are really like, and saying the way you think they are is a mistake. Okay, well, these were good psychological preparation, and they did have some political effect, actually. See, for instance, Neville Shute's novel On the Beach, 1957. Okay, well, that was one vision, interesting one. Along with this, of course, we had the space vision. And this became much more American for obvious reasons, but the way I understood it really was from Arthur Clarke. All those books, Sands of Mars, Islands in the Sky, Earthlight, Prelude to Space, Other Side of the Sky, and also, actually, the Heinlein Juveniles, Farmer in the Sky, Red Planet, Tunnel to the Stars, all that kind of thing. But notice two things about these. One, there was a kind of built-in assumption about acceleration. You know, the top speed you could manage, I'm making these figures up, but should we say the top speed you could manage in 1900 might have been 100 miles an hour. Not too long after that, we were going up to 1,000 miles an hour. Then you were getting, you know, V1s and V2s. V2s going at what, 10,000 miles an hour? And people thought it was going to be like that. You know, I remember when the sound barrier was broken, and the next one was going to be the light barrier. Turned out there were different kinds of barriers, actually. But we didn't know that at the time. So there was a feeling it was going to go on like that, and actually, it was going to go straight through to galactic empires and to Isaac Asimov's Foundation and to all the other galactic empires we know from science fiction, like Jim Schmitz's and Jack Vance's and all that sort of thing. But behind that, there was this assumption that the speed curve was going to go up like that. But then there were those little goblin voices of doubt. Was it really going to be like that? The first person I remember saying that was, again, Arthur Clarke in Childhood's End, where the star-traveling alien, you know, the one who looks like a devil, Kirellin, I think his name was, he actually says at one point, humanity, sorry, you're not on the right scale. The stars are not for man. It's too difficult for you. You can't do it. And Blish, ditto, Jim Blish, we talk about him later, in year 2018, he says the same thing, that even with spin dizzies, you've got to have also the anti-agathic drugs to give you the long life, because without that, human beings are just not on the right scale for star traveling. Well, okay, of course, we've got the answer to that now. We're going to have a warp drive. I read it in Star Trek or something like that. But that, again, is an attempt to get round something which, looked at soberly, appears to be, well, a different kind of proposition. And, of course, this vision, the space exploration vision, has come under severe threat, which I probably don't need to tell you about, but I will anyway. And, of course, I think it's been summed up by Jerry Pournelle. Jerry said, you know, I read science fiction in the 1950s. I always knew I was going to see the first man on the moon. I never dreamed I was going to see the last. But that, I think, sums up, again, a kind of, what shall I say, a kind of recession. In my lifetime, I would say, compared with my father's, expectations have receded. It's very unwelcome thought, but that, I think, is what's been happening. One reaction to this recession of the space vision was, of course, we got another one. And the vision which John Campbell promoted was psionics. And actually, that was there in Childhood's End. Humanity was not capable of star travel, but it was going to do something completely different and go into a kind of, superhuman stage, which, as it happened, the star-traveling aliens did not have the potential for. But that was just the start of a whole stable of Campbellian authors, which I remember, and which I read, of course, all the time when I was a young man. Actually, most of these Campbellian authors turned out to be Randall Garrett, writing under different pseudonyms, something I didn't realize for a while. I think there was one point, there was a whole issue of Astounding, all of which was written by Randall Garrett under, you know, about 4 different pseudonyms. But leaving him aside, you've got people like, well, Blish again, whose Jack of Eagles is in the volume I just waved at you. There was, you know, Wilson Tucker's Wild Talent. And, of course, I remember with great pleasure Alfred Bester's Demolished Man and The Stars My Destination. Well, all these, I think, created a kind of collective vision, everybody thinking of different wrinkles on it and so on, and I may say, convinced me completely. I spent ages guessing bloody card symbols and keeping the scores and trying to learn statistics so I could evaluate, you know, what all this meant. And I may say, I got some damn funny results. And one thing I do know is that I and my mate, we weren't cheating. We may have been, you know, completely no good at designing experiments, but we weren't cheating. And we did get some very funny results. But the thing was, we never got any better. We couldn't, you know, we had no theory about it, and we had no way of improving this. So there may be some buried human capacity in us, and I sometimes think there is. But if so, I can't do anything with it. And psionics, John Campbell's term, was an attempt to combine psi, whatever that stands for. What does it stand for?
Psyche.
Paranormal.
Psyche.
Sorry?
Psyche.
Psyche, oh well, whatever it is. And but the onyx bit was actually taken from electronics, and the idea was that you're going to make psi reliable. Well, if there's one thing it wasn't, it was reliable. So that one, though as I say, very convincing, at least for a while for me, it too got nowhere. And the fourth and the last collective vision I'll mention, which is again very familiar to us all now, is Cyberpunk, now 25 years old. Why did it have such an impact? Well, I think actually it just gave a completely new vision. And in some ways a wrong vision. I mean, you know, there's all this stuff about Zaibatsu, so you can forget about that. The Japanese economy fell out of bed, you know, very shortly afterwards. There was multinationals taking over, fading governmental power. Haven't seen much sign of that around, I may say. And of course, the idea that the future belonged to the hackers and to the people with street smarts. Actually, it doesn't belong to the people with street smarts. It belongs to the boring old bastards with suits on, just the same as it always did. So that was another error, I'm afraid. But just the same, like the others, it looked plausible. The hacker as master of the universe and the asymptotic growth, not of speed, but of information. Okay, well, that was true, and of course it's remained true, and it's still going. The book that got the award for the Campbell Award for 2008 was Cory Doctorow's Little Brother, which in a way is a paean to the growth of information. But I'm surprised that the cyberpunk vision hasn't led on more. I started the Oxford Book of Science Fiction Stories with H.G. Wells, and I ended it with David Brin's Peace Work, and that was quite deliberate. There was a kind of mechanical engineering story at the start, and there was a kind of biopunk story at the end. And I thought that's the way it was going to go. But actually, it didn't. I thought biopunk was the coming vision, the coming collective vision, and the things I was looking at were things like Charles Sheffield's Proteus sequence. I thought this was actually an image of what humans could do to themselves. But although there has been quite a lot of biopunk, and it's still coming along, I'm reading Paolo Bacigalupi's book, The Wind-Up Girl, right now. And that's obviously a biopunk story, which is trying to articulate a vision of the future. But just the same, as far as I can see, at the moment, it has not taken off the way cyberpunk did. It has not gone collective in the same kind of way. Well, I'm asking myself, no, I'm not overrunning yet. What am I waiting for? Are we looking, as I've been kind of suggesting, at a further slowdown? 1900 to 1955, yeah. 1955 to 2010, yeah. 2010 to 2065. Don't like to think about it, but you may remember the old astounding science fiction poster of the rocket pointing to the skies, tethered down by washing lines. And on all the washing lines, there were diapers hanging. And that's what's holding the rockets down. Well, I get this nasty feeling sometimes that during my lifetime, there has been a window of opportunity for getting through to a new stage. And that window of opportunity was caused by a flood of cheap energy. And I wonder whether this is actually coming to an end, and if so, what the hell's going to happen next? I mean, Peter and I are basically sitting around in England waiting for the lights to go out because our government is quite incapable of any future planning further than the next election, which in this case is about 8 weeks off. So as far as they're concerned, if the lights go out after 8 weeks and a day, that's all right, they won't be there. So we, you know, have we missed the window of opportunity? Has our chance actually been destroyed by all the effort that we put during my lifetime and my father's to fighting each other? I sometimes think, you know, I used to fire a machine gun. All those cartridge cases. How much of the world's easy reserves of copper have been made into cartridge cases and shell cases and thrown in the sea or dumped? Because I didn't pick all mine up, you know. Because there were too many of them. I don't know. I don't know what the figures would be like. But it strikes me as an incredible amount of waste, which had gone to nothing. And during that time, we could have used it for something more productive. Well, have we missed our window of opportunity? I remember a Niven story, the end of a Niven story, which was called At the Bottom of a Hole. And in this, of course, we have a version of the space vision in which everything's moved out to the asteroids because that's where the resources are. And the guy who comes from the asteroids is talking to, you know, an old person, and he says, what did we go into space for? Obvious, isn't it? There's everything in space. Monopoles, metal, vacuum, free fall, room to test things, a place to learn physics? And the old guy looks at him and says, was it all that obvious before we got here? And he says, of course it was. Then he looks at the old guy and he realizes how old he was. He sees the signs of age on him. He realizes he goes back to the time before. And he says, wasn't it? Well, very good example of the rhetorical question. And the answer is, no. And even in a way, it's a very optimistic story, but it has a kind of threatening ending. I feel, actually, what science fiction needs to do, perhaps, is to integrate politics and technology more credibly, following the long, old model of Heinlein, of course, the man who sold the moon. These visions have not been sold successfully. You could do it. A good example, I think, is Fred Pohl's 1984 book, The Years of the City, which envisages a kind of different political future. And there's another dialogue I'd like to quote from Ian Banks in one of his non-science fiction books. And it goes like this, two characters talking, and one of them says, expressing a view which is actually very common, history's finished. Capitalist democracy has won, and the rest is mopping up. And the other character says, and this is Ian Banks speaking, I feel, bullshit. You ought to read more science fiction. Nobody who reads science fiction comes out with this crap about the end of history. That's right. History has not come to an end, and we don't know what the hell the next thing's going to be. And my question, in a way, is, I've said, have we missed our window of opportunity? Can capitalist democracy cope with the long term? Not much goddamn sign of it, as far as I can see. See, as I say, the energy situation in the UK. Another question, can computers cope with the great crisis of our time, which is bureaucracy? No, actually, as we all know, they've reinforced it. So, these are not good signs. Okay. So, I'm saying some rather downbeat things here, and I will now go back to my life as a professor. When I went into the goddamn trade, I was expecting all kinds of things to happen. And I just like to say, none of them happened. I thought, we were going to really understand about how narrative worked. And what do we get? We got narratology, which tells us nothing. I thought we were going to have a really powerful linguistics. And what do we get? We got ret and comp classes, which I used to sit on. Absolutely hopeless. I thought we were going to actually get really a serious study of science fiction and fantasy. And what did we get? What does the Modern Language Association really do nowadays? It does victimology in something which I have no interest in whatsoever, never having been enrolled among the victim classes. Just the opposite, usually. So all these things were complete failures. Now, the trade, I would say, turned its back on two things. It turned its back on what people actually read in favor of literature. And as Darko Suvin rightly said, writing about science fiction, he said, any study which refuses to consider 90% of its subject material will be wrong even about the 10% it does study. And that was quite correct. And the other thing it did, and I'm professor of English language, right? It turned its back, it set its face like flint against any form of disciplined language study. Yes. All these, I think, were really disastrous. And I'll tell you what the disaster was. I said this a few years ago at an academic conference, and it went down very badly with the full professors, but the graduate students, you could see them thinking hard about this. And the figures are these. In 1980, in the US, there were 65,000 majors in English. Since then, the student population has doubled. We ought, therefore, to have 130,000 students reading English. How many have we got? 49,000. Now, when I was selling toothpaste and scouring powder, I would say, hey, that means we have lost, click, 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 63% of our market share. If we had been selling toothpaste and had so lost 63% of our market share, I can tell you our CEOs would not be drawing fat salaries at Duke University. They'd all have been fired. Well, like I say, the full professors didn't like me saying that, but the graduate students in the front row doing their 6 years PhDs and getting no job at the end of it, as one of the full professors he said later, he said, I didn't agree with you there, Tom, but I could see that what you said made a powerful emotional impact on the young people. I thought, you bet, they realized they've just been shafted. So, things can go wrong, and I extrapolate, as it were, from that, and I wonder, what's the situation now? There's a lot of science fiction around. Yeah, okay. There are a lot of plots available, there are a lot of scenarios available, and what you can do very often is combine them and rejig them, and that's okay. But there's been a drift to fantasy. I've got nothing against fantasy. Michael Swanwick is at the conference. I was going to say greatest living author of fantasy, and I checked because Jack Vance is still alive. So I'd have to say greatest active author of fantasy. Okay, so got nothing against fantasy, but I do remember a science fiction author whose name I will not mention, but it was Piers Anthony, actually. I said, why have you stopped writing science fiction, started writing fantasy? And he said, 7 words. He said, quarter the work, 10 times the money. Yes, can't argue with that really, but I don't like it very much. And there's been a drift to things like alternate history, written them myself. But, you know, I think in a way that's a kind of an evasion. I'm not interested in alternate history. I'm interested in what's going to happen next. And that's what I really don't know about. Well, Brian Aldiss said once, and I don't agree with much of what he said, but he said his idea of heaven was a giant console in the sky. And there you would sit in the giant console with a supply of whiskey ready to hand, and you could just look down and see what happened next. Because we don't know what's going to happen next. But I'd like to know what would happen next, and I'd like to have some ideas about what's going to happen next, some different ideas. And that's what I look at science fiction for. Well, last question, is the science fiction century over? No, I don't think so. But I do get that sense that I'm waiting for the booster rocket to fire. I want something more to happen, and I want it to tell me what's going to happen next. And I think, you know, it'll be something, that's what science fiction tells you, it'll be something we can't predict, but we should be thinking about it. Okay, thanks very much. Questions, sir?
Science fiction historically has had an optimistic view of the future. You know, we're going into space, we're doing all these wonderful things, galactic empires, you name it. But now, it seems now, if you look at the world, you know, you have what seems to be insoluble problems. The rise of the immoral multinational corporation, illiteracy, poverty, all kinds of major issues, global climate change, which can, God only knows what the result of that will be. So do you have a sense, though, that the sense of optimism is on the wane, that's been tempered by current events that didn't really exist prior to this current time?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I actually was reading the Wall Street Journal this morning, and I was thinking, you know, what they say all the time is, you know, what the percentage of growth has been for this quarter and that economy. I think, well, one thing I'm pretty sure about is that growth has got to stop at some point. Don't know when, of course, and I'm not saying, you know, it's now, but that seems to be a consideration which has not been thought of. And of course, there are all kinds of things. I'm not really bothered about global warming. I know Kim Stanley Robinson is, okay. But as Brian Aldiss said, one of the other things he got right, he said, if you're talking to Brits, he said, it's no good telling them the world's going to get warmer. They say, oh, that's nice. I think I'll have a peach tree on the back wall. I could have it in Australia. He said, if you want to frighten them, you've got to talk about ice ages. Okay. So global warming, you know, I don't care. It sounds okay to me. But there's other things, you know. I mean, ask Peter, he moans about it all the time. The energy's going to run out. What are we going to do? I know the guy who runs the fusion program. He was a colleague of mine at Oxford. I saw him on the TV a few weeks ago giving the blither about how they were going to get fusion power licked and it was going to solve anything. I heard him say it 30 years ago. Same word. Nothing's happened since. Yeah, except we spent a hell of a lot of money, of course. So yeah, and then there are other things I could bring up, but these seem, and behind it I think there's this fear that our political system will not think long term. Yeah. It can't.
It can't.
That's right. So what are we going to do? Give me my Lee Enfield and 50 rounds. I could at least get someone's attention. However, yeah, sorry. But I think Mary Kay actually is
Actually, I had one quick question and a comment. Are you still professoring? And if you are, may I please come and attend your lectures? Yeah.
No, I've stopped professoring. I'm now, I've got a new acronym, you know, like Yuppies. I'm now a PBOP, which is Poor Broken Down Old Age Pensioner.
I think you underestimate the impact that computers are having on our lives and how we live them. I mean, my mother's generation, I'm about the same age as you.
Yeah.
My mother's generation cannot understand how important my laptop and my iPhone are to me, and the fact that I really want my iPhone implanted in my brain.
Yeah, yeah.
And I, on the other hand, can barely understand my niece and my nephews in the worlds that they live in their computers.
Yes.
So I think that perhaps that is where we need to look for our big changes coming.
Possibly. I mean, I can see why one thinks that. But I've been using computers for more than 25 years now, and I remember the been continuous improvement. No question about that. Even more than cars, I may say. But has it made a big difference?
The difference between my DOS machine and my iPhone are more than qualitative.
Yeah.
I've been looking for a job lately, and anything I knew about job searching 2 years ago is wrong and dead.
Yeah.
If I do not have a LinkedIn account and a Facebook account, no one knows I exist. The job search skills I had 2 years ago are useless.
It's not going to be like the Cyberpunks told us, but I think that's
It's
for a lot
totally
of-
different. It's totally changed that whole part of our culture, how to get a job. I can't get one without a computer. I can't get one without a smartphone with me all the time because I'm in technology. If I can't text someone back right away or get back to them within 10 minutes, next candidate.
Yeah, well, okay, and I hear it all. I look around at the faces, actually, and I see some agreeing with you and some actually not agreeing with you. So obviously, there are different opinions.
Yeah.
Not evenly distributed.
Fiction again, Tom.
Yeah, sorry.
Your comments on global warming may help me understand this a little bit, but I noticed an absence of referrals to Ursula K. Le Guin,
Yeah.
and in particular her Hamish series, which I think shows a certain view and brings in very strongly the ecological component, which I think is something that even more than lack of energy, if we don't have air, the lack of energy really doesn't matter that much. So how do you see her fitting into the history that you've described?
Sorry.
Ursula K. Le Guin.
Yeah, yeah.
The
Sorry,
Hamish
which
series.
books are you thinking of, especially?
Dispossessed, well, The Telling, the most recent one
Yeah.
in that series.
Yes. Well,
The whole background of it is
yeah,
the Earth that was ecologically devastated,
yeah, yeah.
and then going out in
Yes.
sort of fashion.
Well, in a way, the talent, for instance, seems to me to be, a kind of a psionics book. I know it's not John Campbell stuff, but it's the same kind of idea. The Dispossessed, very interesting book, very interesting structurally, but again, it's sort of, it's trying to get around the light barrier. It's all about the Ansible. Yeah. We all know what an Ansible is, we just haven't got one. It's like warp speed. If we had that, if we had warp speed and fusion power and an Ansible, okay, problem over. But we don't.
Word for world is forest.
Well, again, a very interesting book. And the thing I appreciated most as a professor of English language was the way that she imitated Vietnam speak. Because Vietnam speak was not just semantics, the strange words, it was also crap syntax. But the characters there talk, and where actually, I used to watch the Watergate inquiries, long ago, and I remember watching the guy who was Bush's, spin doctor, and he came on, they asked him a question, and he replied, and at the end of his reply, I hadn't got the faintest idea what we were talking about. And actually I thought, hey, that guy is good. That is what I call double talk. But then I realized a bit later, he thought like that. It was not actually put on, that was the way he thought. And at that point I became worried, because actually that meant that wasn't double talk, that was double think. And that meant that he couldn't do anything, actually. You couldn't send him out to buy the fish and chips. And I thought, if this guy is determining our kind of political and military policy, well, if I was a soldier, I'd run away. You couldn't possibly win like that. So very interesting. Dispossessed was also, I thought, a very good answer to Orwell's 1984 and Newspeak. She actually considered all the linguistic points about it. And one of the 15 articles I wrote was all about that. So I thought it was very interesting, but it doesn't help me about what's going to happen next.
professors emeriti from the Latin ex meaning used to be and meritus good.
That's right, or has been, as we say, yeah. Sorry, is that just a remark or
Just a remark.
Okay, right, yes, well, just so. Over there?
I have a question, it's more English literature related, because one thing I find just insane in the English is how much they try to make everything more and more complicated.
Yeah.
To the point where people that should like to read and should like to write, write completely indecipherable material.
I know, yeah,
Think
yeah.
it's ever going to change?
Yeah.
Go towards clarity?
One thing is going to change that, actually, and I've seen it happening already, is that the students are all voting with their feet.
Right.
And if the students vote with their feet, then, at some point, you've got no job.
Right.
The only trouble is the people who are responsible usually have tenure.
Right.
So, I mean, there is a solution to that, and I think I have an unmatched record for getting rid of people. I was really a terrific hatchet man. I was just so unpleasant to people that they'd retire to get away from me. And actually, the person I always muddled myself on was a Tolkien character. Sorry to bring Tolkien in, but I always admired Ugluk the orc. He gets people sort of arguing with him, and he goes, slash, slash! And I thought, that's the way to do department meetings. That's right. So yeah, but why are they like that? Well, I think it's really what I was saying about doublethink. It's not that they do that deliberately, to confuse or obfuscate. They've been taught to think like that. Poor bastards. They'll never recover. But I know, actually, I was telling somebody that the two insults I've received in my life, which I appreciate most, one, because I said I quite like the Tolkien movies, one of the head Tolkien fans accused me of Sarumanian accommodationism. Hey! I made it at last. And the other one, and this I couldn't actually understand, but one of my medieval colleagues said that my habit of trying to write as if I wanted people to understand what I was saying, only she didn't put it like that, meant that I had to be considered as a textual rapist. So, I don't even know how to do that. But it obviously made sense to her at some level. But I don't know, I mean, it's been, one of the striking things is, I write for some of the journals like London Review of Books, Times Literary Supplement, and these general interest literary outlets, New York Review of Books, just the same, they regard kind of professional literary criticism with open contempt. They just think that's not interesting anymore. When I went into the trade, people were actually interested in literary critics. They used to get mentioned in the papers. Now it's, the print runs that the university presses bring out, they're so tiny. It's not what, $2.50 is a respectable print run. It's hardly worth typing it out for that. So, yeah, very sad.
Is text messaging shortcuts that are being used now going to have any, in terms of what's coming next, permanent effects on the language?
No, I think language has got more inertia than that. So no, I think that's kind of interesting, but a minor phenomenon. What's interesting to me is the fact that for the first time in the history of the world, English and Spanish are in close, continuous contact. Yes, that's right. There are some things I do notice that British and American English are drifting apart in syntactic ways, not in grammar. The grammar is different. The modal verbs. Modal verbs are so interesting. None of my colleagues in literature knows what they are. They wouldn't tell a modal verb if it bit them in the backside. Which it wouldn't, of course, but there. Sorry, one more question, then I think we've got to go.
I just had a thought from all of this, that when you talk about how your cell phone has changed and everything and so on, the one thing that will never happen again in the history of mankind will be that someone will, as happened in the first century, somebody wrote to, I think, the Emperor Vespasian and said, everything that can be invented has been invented. That's it. There's no further room for improvement. No one will ever have that perspective again.
No, that's right. That's right. Or at least it would take a really serious collapse to get back to that level. I guess the other thing I'd say, talk about the first century. Sorry?
He was wrong.
Yeah. Talking about the first century, if you ask the Emperor Vespasian, what's going to be the world language in 2,000 years' time? Obviously, all the crawlers would have said Latin. The intellectuals would have said Greek. really clever people might say, well, far away, this is this empire of people with slant eyes, you know, there's a lot of them. Maybe it's going to be their language, Chinese. And pessimists might have said, there's these guys coming down from the north, you know, I mean, Goths. I think there's an outside chance for Gothic. At the same time, English was mentioned for the first time. The English were mentioned for the first time in history. Tacitus said, well, looking at the Germans, there's a group of 7 of them about which there's nothing interesting to say. There's nothing special about them separately at all. Collectively, though, there's one interesting thing. They have a habit of worshipping the goddess Nerthus, and they worship the goddess Nerthus by drowning people in bogs. So anybody who said, look, the world language is going to be the one spoken by that group, the third in this group of 7 no-hopers, the ones all covered in mud, coming back from a drowning party. There's the future.
From the Draco Vista Studios in Phoenix, Arizona.
All systems stable.
Take 1.
Dude, our brains have to be broken to do this.
Well, I guess golf is better than Lake Placid, too.
Oh, okay.
Do we have Whovian news here?
You say geek like it's a bad thing.
Flash. Stop it.
Oh,
Stop it.
And now the news.
Think science fiction has nothing to do with your life?
What?
Think again. It's Slice of Sci-Fi.
Roll sound.